All right, today we are talking about Ode Gen 2, not to be confused with Ode Gen 2 burrs. This is the Gen 2 grinder, which addresses a lot of interesting problems that I've seen the original Ode have, and I'd like to kind of talk about my impressions of this grinder and really spend a lot of time just talking about the original Ode. For transparency, Fellow did send this grinder over for review, but they did not send me any money or anything in exchange. So all these are my opinions. So I'd like to start everything off by just talking about the original Ode from kind of two perspectives. One is the, hey, this is my first grinder, it's $300, it's super expensive, I want to upgrade, I'm getting one of these. And then I also want to talk about it from the perspective of someone who is in the higher end side of the enthusiast community. Like, what if you already own a lot of grinders, or you've already dove deep and you're viewing this point? Like, how would you view this grinder? Let's start off with that first perspective of, like, I felt like this grinder was targeted for a lot of noobs, entry-level folks, right? Which is, this is going to be their highest end grinder. $299 for a grinder is a lot of money, right? So when they jumped into there from, for example, maybe a Baratza or a Hario hand grinder, they jumped over to something like this, they would expect every single one of their problems to be solved. I kind of felt like they didn't really get that, which is for $299, there were so many compromises in really the quality of life of using the grinder. I think a lot of folks would appreciate the flavor profile of the version 1 and 1.1 burrs, but it was kind of everything else with the grinder that made it a little painful to use. I think a lot of folks expected, hey, in my Baratza and my Hario, I just put the beans in and I'm good to go. This is not like that. The version 1 is definitely not like that. You know, you would see a lot of different things of, like, okay, people were not able to feed the beans in properly. Their beans would get stuck if they were using darker roasted coffee. There was static. If you ground coffee and you walked away, this entire section would just randomly fill with coffee. The retention of this grinder was not good. It was messy. If you were someone who was completely beginning out into this coffee world and you spent $300 on a grinder, you probably would be having a terrible time. And that's kind of that first perspective. And what I will say is that a lot of those things have been addressed with this grinder. Like, this group of people is their first time dealing with a flapper grinder. Like, yeah, you gotta RDT, you gotta do all these different things, right? But if you were a complete noob, there's no way you would know that. You would never figure that out from the marketing. Like, you're trying to buy a grinder, you're looking at that, you're just like, this is gonna solve all my problems. Like, the experience of using the Ode just never was as streamlined as you really thought it should have been if you were a complete noob. Now, here's the interesting perspective, or really the other side of the perspective, which is high-end home enthusiast, right? Like, if you were already spending a lot of money on grinders, you would look at this grinder and you would be like, wait a second, $299, that is an absolute steal for a grinder that can fit 64 millimeter flats, that is of this size, and that is supported by a fantastic company. That was the perspective that I felt like a lot of folks in the enthusiast community had, is value. This is cheap. This is really, really great value, because all you would do is you would buy an Ode for $300, toss those burrs out, put your SSP burrs in, and you have a $450, $500 grinder that performs at $1,500, $2,000. And kind of just what I've observed is a lot of people that I know, you just end up with multiple Odes. People purchase 2, 3, 4 Odes just to put all the different SSP burrs in. And at that point, you're still cheaper than something like the P64, and you have 3 different SSP burr sets, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And of course, I'm really mainly talking about it from a filter brewing perspective, is that, yeah, if you're using the same burrs as a $1,500, $2,000 Titan grinder, you're getting very, very similar results. Of course, I'm assuming everything is aligned properly. You know, a lot of problems that people experience with the Ode, even in this entry-level group of people I'm talking about, the enthusiast community really tried to solve. For example, we really saw the introduction of things like a bellows system that people were creating for the Ode, which really tried to minimize a lot of the retention and helped blow the beans down into the grinder. You know, like a lot of different things that the enthusiast community tried to solve with this grinder in the form of, let's put better burrs in it, let's make it cleaner, all these different mods, like a stepless mod and all of that. I actually really feel like Fellow has targeted these problems and really solved them in this grinder. So let's talk about Gen 2 Ode. Generation 2 Ode really interesting fixes. Really, when we think about it, they're kind of only 3 fixes with this grinder. And honestly, these 3 fixes solve so many different problems that I had and many people had with the Ode, which is make it so that I don't have to push the beans down. I don't want these beans to get stuck here anymore. Make it so that the grinder is much cleaner and give me better tasting coffee. So there were kind of many stopgap solutions that Fellow tried to do, right? Which is like, let's introduce better burrs, like these Gen 2 burrs that you can stick in your Ode. But these didn't really solve the underlying problems of, oh yeah, the grinder's really messy. This is so much better. What we have here is a different chute. It's much steeper, and if you put in some dark, oily beans, it is actually usable. Those beans will not get stuck. The angle has really improved where the beans actually feed into the grinder, and I am having a way better time using this grinder. I never really complained too much about having to push the beans in or anything. What has annoyed me a little is if I'm using egregiously large coffee beans. I have this chunker bean here. What happens with the original Ode is these beans will just get stuck up here. These don't get stuck in this Ode anymore. The clearance for coffee beans is much better. That might be an edge case, of course, but that's one thing that they've really improved up here is the first touch point of what you're using the grinder, which is I want to pour the beans in. I want the beans to go into the grinder. That has been drastically solved. The next kind of point of concern is static messiness with the grinder. Okay, so let's do a quick fun sound demo / let's grind coffee in these to try to demonstrate how much nicer this grinder, Gen 2, is to use over Gen 1. Let's do initially just dry, starting grinders. Gen 2 now. Very similar starting sounds. So here's Gen 2. You might be able to hear on the mic the ionizer. You may hear a little staticky noise or an electric sound. I'm just gonna put 20 grams of pretty darkly roasted processed coffee into here. You can see the oils. This is Gen 1. So I did an RDT there, and if I touch this, I'll actually get static. That was a big problem with this grinder. If you put SSP burrs in this guy, you touch it, you'd get static. If I move this out of the way, you probably will see coffee grounds all stuck over the top here, as well as if I whack the grinder at all, we will see grounds just kind of fall out. So if I take this, on the catch cup, we see a bunch of grounds here, and then at this angle with the camera, you don't see, but there are a lot of grounds up here. So if I do this, there are all these grounds that have, because of static, they've stuck to the top. And if I whack this, you should see a fair bit of grounds just come out. So that is kind of the typical Ode version 1 experience. Now let's look at Gen 2 Ode. It's gonna pour the beans in. What you'll notice is because they've raised this up, we actually can fit more coffee in here. I believe this is about 100, this was 80, but really the pool of coffee beans is more uniformly around this area so that it seems like they can just go in easier, but we'll grind. And I'm grinding even finer than before. That's done, and watch this. I touch this, no static at all. I'm not shocking myself like I just shocked myself over there. I move this out of the way. Wow, magic. It's clean. And we look at this here, and now I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna whack this. Look at that. This versus this. That's the biggest difference right there. And it is just, you don't need to RDT with this grinder now. It is just so frictionless. Just put the beans in, press the grind button, everything works. You can use the knocker here but it doesn't really seem to do anything. Watch my table suffer right now. I see coffee grounds all the way along the edges that have basically pulled up due to static. Yeah, very typical. And then watch this. More grounds just fly out when I do that. Let's look at our Gen 2. It's way cleaner. I mean, if you just, if I whack this, nothing comes out. If we look at kind of that distance of where did these coffee grounds pool, it's way more in the center. This has spread out everywhere with static up here. It's all messy. Got grounds everywhere, right? This here is really clean. I mean, that's amazing right there. That they fixed it. They really fixed it. And you get this type of experience regardless of what burr you put in, right? We could put our SSPs in and we would get like the cleanest SSP burr grinding experience. A lot of these other grinders that are way more expensive you still got to deal with static. You still got to RDT, right? This guy, 350 bucks, I don't need an RDT. I just put the beads in, I put my SSP burrs in. Like, come on, that's pretty good. What I'm very happy to say is you do not need to RDT with this grinder. Or if you do RDT, it really doesn't make too big of a difference. You can grind coffees through here and it is completely fine. And they've also adjusted the catch cup size as well. Now, I've never really been a big fan of this catch cup. I never really liked this lid. This has always been annoying where my grounds will get stuck inside here, and then these fins have been a little bit painful to use. But it does seem that because this is a little bit wider, the coffee doesn't really pull so much to the edges, and the actual kind of spout in which you pour the beans out is a little bit larger as well, and it makes it just a little bit less bad to use, I guess. Now let's also talk a little bit about these burrs here. So these are the Gen 2 burrs. They are awesome because of their price point and because they're designed by a really awesome guy. Nick, if you're watching this, you are awesome. These are probably one of the most forgiving burr sets out there, especially when you consider the price point of these. These are definitely kind of in that category of like all-rounder burr sets. Let's make everything taste good. And in my opinion, they're very sweetness focused, really great body to them, but it's really hard to make them taste bad. You can kind of grind pretty fine, and it's pretty hard to push astringency out of these burrs. It actually offers a fairly like balanced profile, but you can definitely get some nice acidity out of these burrs. They're not like, acidity, clarity focused like you find in something like the SSP MP. I'm gonna save a lot of my opinions for this for maybe a future video with Nick, so we'll see that. Otherwise, we'll do a whole video on all these 64mm burrs at a later date. So I'm kind of saving my full thoughts on these burrs. Yeah, they let you grind way finer than version 1, 1.1. These burrs, honestly, like even if you had a version 1 Ode, you should still pick these burrs up. They're awesome. There are also some kind of internal adjustments as well. One thing that I have noticed is this. So in my experience of using a variety of Odes, the dial has always been really hit or miss. There have been kind of pretty big unit tolerances here, and I think it's because of the auger. Changing grind size across different Odes may just feel different. Some Odes are smoother than others, but on this one, this is really smooth, out of the box. And maybe I'm lucky and I got one that is nice and smooth, but this has just a much nicer feel to it when I'm adjusting grind size than the original Ode here. And this is just a stock 1.1 Ode. And there's something about this where it's like I'm feeling like metals touching each other. This one here just feels so much smoother, and I believe they have adjusted something with the auger in here, and it makes it just a little bit easier to actually work with. I haven't had a chance to open this Ode up. They've kind of changed a little bit of things on here, like which of the grind sizes should you use. This is still a fingerprint magnet, and one thing also is that the motor hasn't changed, is that it still uses the same motor, which I think for some folks might be a disappointment. I know a lot of people were wondering, would this be an espresso grinder? And the answer is no. I don't really think that this was intended to be an espresso grinder. I think this is just such a great evolution of the original Ode. Like the original Ode was always viewed as like, hey, this is a really great filter grinder, but there are all these different problems, mainly with the cleanliness. Now, this is a grinder that it does cost a little more, 350 bucks, But there's really no but here at this point. There's no like, oh yeah, here's a $350 grinder, but it doesn't grind fine enough, but it is messy, right? There really is no kind of big egregious compromise here, especially because this is a filter grinder. This is for brew purposes, right? Like, you cannot find a better grinder at this price point that is offering this level of performance, and more so the flexibility of a 64mm platform at this price point. It's also kind of crazy to me that this is only a $50 upgrade to this. $350 basically to solve every single workflow problem with this grinder and give me better burrs. That's kind of crazy. There isn't this, oh my god, I just spent $300 on a grinder and I'm having a terrible time, or it's like, oh, this is a budget grinder, I'm willing to deal with all these problems. This is a grinder now that is incredibly well-rounded. And honestly, it's pretty fantastic. I'm very happy with this grinder. Small changes, but really, really big solves. And I think the team at Fellow should be very proud with what they have come out with, because this is a great grinder. So yeah, that's kind of my first impressions look at the Ode Gen 2, not Gen 2 Ode burrs, which we will hopefully make a full-length video on at a later date. But otherwise, that's the Ode Gen 2. Thank you so much for spending the time watching this video. If you have any questions, let me know. But otherwise, I'll see you guys around.